Warning, the following program contains scenes of death.
Time. What is it? But an imaginary form of measurement designed by man to give him the comfort that he has the control over any single event, when in fact the control that he levies is not dissimilar to the control that a weatherman has over the weather. Life is an illusion. We are rats waiting to be dissected. Such is the case of two teenagers who believed that they held sway on events surrounding their immediate future.
One-time events, like the universe, where did it come from? Surely nature and unexplained, unexplained. Or if there's a miracle and we have lots and lots of evidence, how do we do for the resurrection? Well now,
Flying over the tracks at approximately 100 feet above. I heard there's some murders of two young boys.
Often we forget that life is a gift given by an Indian giver that can be taken back at any time. And yet we flaunt this gift, rubbing it in the face of the proverbial giver. Case in point, it was shortly after midnight the two best friends said goodbye to their families and set out with a packed lunch and a rifle to do some hunting. But little did they know, they were already one step into the abyss. The two best friends had set out to go spotlighting a form of hunting illegal in Arkansas, where a flashlight is shone into the animal's eyes, transfixing them while the other person fires. Along the tracks were the boys' usual hunting ground. The driver, in shock and now medicated, said that it appeared the two teens had been sleeping and laid out side by side, covered by a green tarp used as a makeshift blanket. He'd applied his brakes to the mile-long train traveling at 55 miles an hour and sounded the horn. But I guess the boys were heavy sleepers. And when the cops and the meat wagon arrived to scrape the boys up, it looked like a retard had been given haircuts with a chainsaw. I ain't gonna lie to you, 'cause lying ain't my business. 16-year-old Don Henry's head had been thrown over 500 feet or found in the water by a fisherman, floating like a beach ball with a smile painted on it. But it's hard to say whether it were a happy smile or not. Probably not. Hillbilly cops figured that it was a suicide pact, maybe even one of those well-documented homosexual suicide pacts. But when they told the parents what they'd figured happened, they weren't buying it. They knew their kids weren't depressed, and they knew they weren't homos. Certainly not homo enough to kill themselves. Things just didn't add up, and if hillbilly cops refused to do their arithmetic, well then they'd have to do it for them. It was a week after the funeral. A funeral that authorities were all too happy to see the last shovel of dirt dropped, that the county coroner released his findings. Old Marble Eyes Malik had concluded in record time that Don Henry and Kevin Ives perished because of THC poisoning, the main component of marijuana, and that each of the boys had the equivalent of 20 joints each in their system, and that they simply gone, laid on the tracks, fallen asleep, and went into a drug-induced coma. And died a painless death, if you can consider getting chopped in half and decapitated painless.
Pain is relevant.
Yeah, easy for you to say. In the driver's statement, he said by the time he'd placed the train into emergency position, it was 3 to 5 seconds until impact, which might not seem like a long time, but for him, it must have seemed like an eternity when bearing down on two children. Although the hillbilly cops said the case was closed, the parents weren't so easily convinced and hired their own private detective to do a little poking around, because some of the pieces of the puzzle just didn't fit. Like, why were the teenagers laid out so neatly on those tracks? Almost like they were waiting for the Reaper. And what happened to the camouflage green top that the driver said were covering them? The green top that the parents said neither boy owned. So who covered up the bodies? Witnesses say they saw a man wearing combat fatigues leaving the scene after the boys had been killed. Police were never able to find this mystery man, but private detectives were able to uncover that only a week earlier, a man wearing combat fatigues was seen acting suspicious in the area. And when the officer attempted to question him, he fired at the officer and then fled the scene. And this man was never found. The more private dicks uncovered, the more questions they had. It had been 5 months since the two boys had been left to the mercy of the worms, and authorities had ruled their death an accident when the boys' parents held a press conference for the nation's press and shared their privately funded findings. And it was then, under public scrutiny, that the hillbilly cops were forced to reopen the case.
17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry were struck by a train near Alexander. The medical examiner has said that the boys were asleep and drugged with marijuana. The parents, however, disputed that claim and persuaded authorities to reopen the case.
Keith Coney, he wasn't known for keeping a secret. Well, at least not for long anyways, because he was hanging out at the arcade, drinking beer in the parking lot, telling everybody who'd listen that on the night that his buddies got hit by a train, they were all hanging out drinking near the tracks when they saw a low-flying plane drop a package. And when the teens were spotted, shots were fired, and the boys ran and went into town and met up in front of a store to talk about their adventure. And with then the Keith spotted the cops having an uneasy relationship with him. He hopped on his motorcycle and drove away. But curious to find out what the piggies wanted, he stopped around the corner, just out of view. When the two cars arrived, one marked, one unmarked, he saw an officer grab Donnie's rifle and smash him in the face. Then the three officers beat the other boy, then threw them both in the back of the unmarked car. This were around 1 a.m. and it was the last time he would see his friends. Well, until he saw him getting scraped up on the news. Keith also told this story to his mother, but she told him to keep his mouth shut and mind his business to matters of his concern, which I personally think were pretty sound advice. It was around the same time that Keith was sharing his filthy little secret, that Donnie and Kevin's parents were able to get an independent forensics expert to re-exhume the boys' bodies and conduct their own autopsy. Dr. Joseph Burton was a national recognized forensics expert, and his findings were drastically different from the state's. He concluded that Kevin had been stabbed in the back multiple times, and Donnie's facial wounds were consistent with having his face smashed to a pulp with a rifle butt. Very different from just getting high and falling asleep, and he believed this happened before they were hit by the train.
This information alone would strongly suggest that the boys were injured, rendered unconscious, or even killed prior to their bodies being run over by the train.
It seemed now that there were some questions that needed answering, but it were a bigger shitstorm that were brewing when the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, not only defended his incompetent state coroner, but gave him a 41% raise, which naturally got a lot of people asking, why, Billy boy, why?
Dr. Malik refused repeated requests to talk with us. But when we caught up with him, he said people didn't like him because he's from Egypt. And he claimed he had never made a single mistake in any of the 7,000 autopsies he conducted.
People say that as the state medical examiner, you were incompetent and you bungled cases, and that Governor Clinton, for some reason, defended you and protected you. Is that the case?
You have to understand that I did 7,000 autopsies. Not one single case overturned because of me.
Not a single case?
Not one single case.
Or at this point, as a controversy started to unfold in the national news, the Keith Coney told his mom he had to come forward with what he knew. And over against her wishes, he phoned a local paper in Little Rock and said he had a story that were going to shake up this state. He said they were coming in to tell him the whole story about what happened to his friends. But he never made it. And he never was gonna make it. Police reported that he'd stolen the motorcycle he was driving that day, and they were a high-speed pursuit. And these sort of things happen. You know the score. And despite a statewide grand jury investigation for drug trafficking at the highest level, including the government, the case was officially closed December 31st, 1988, and the files sealed tighter than the Velcro straps on a cripple's boot. But it was in the summer of 2017 when a has-been wrestler came forward saying that he found Jesus and that he'd been a bodyguard for a drug cartel all those years back in Little Rock. And he was there that night on the tracks, and he saw those two young boys being laid out in the tracks like slaughtered pigs. And he says he knows those behind the crime, including government officials.
I'm Billy Jack Haynes, former World Wrestling Federation wrestler. Today I come with no mask, I come with no hidden voice, I come to you straight face to face because this is reality, man. Don't hide nothing. 30 years ago, I witnessed the murder of two teenagers on the railroad tracks, August 23rd, Alexander, Arkansas. 27 years of that, I was a drug addict on pain pill medication. I become clean. It kept bothering me and bothering me and bothering me, and finally,
close the door, leave your clothes on the floor, I'll tell you what to do. I've heard your words before, there's always something more, love's not always true. You can try to run away, but you know the ghosts will stay and lock you in their chains. So come
Legion forever!
The book says no more.